As I always say in these introductions to our second series, we're looking at the relationship between democracy and capitalism. And as I like to kick off the interview, I get the people I talk to define capitalism. Today, we're talking to Stephanie Kelton, who's the author of The Deficit Myth, Modern Monetary Theory and the Birth of the People's Economy. Stephanie is not only a distinguished economist and an advisor to some very high-level Democratic candidates, but she's also, I think, I wouldn't say the founder, but a participant in revolutionary economic theory. So, Stephanie, why don't we kick off by you defining what you mean by capitalism in the context of modern monetary theory?
Well, I think my definition probably would not change before I heard of MMT or became someone who's involved with scholarship and building that out. I think of capitalism as an economic system that is dependent upon the existence of private property, oriented around production for profit, and where, it's an inherently, if you like, unequal game in the sense that it requires capitalists and workers, and capitalists are the people who hire the workers, and you can't have capitalism without, this relationship where one party to the relationship owns the means of production and the other party has to sell labor or labor power, if you like, in order to earn a wage, where the person with the property rights, the rights to own the capital, is in a preferred position, let's say.
Stephanie, the radical power of modern monetary theory lies in your rethinking of the relationship, I think, between capitalism and money, or between capitalism and currency and government. Why is modern monetary theory so radical?
I think it's, maybe it's radical in the sense that it upends so many deeply held beliefs, or what we think are understandings of the role that public money and taxes and debt play in our government's finances. So I think it just runs counter. It challenges many deeply held beliefs about, let's say, why we pay taxes to the federal government, for example, and the government's fiscal capacities, whether the government needs to come to us, the taxpayer, or to us, the saver, in order to borrow to fund expenditures. And MMT flips a lot of the conventional thinking on its head, and it's initially unsettling, and I think for that reason it feels radical.
Yeah, you've referred to it in your book when you began to understand it, or were convinced of it, as a Copernican moment in terms of rethinking the very nature of government and economics. Would it be fair to say that modern monetary theory suggests that the notion of an economic deficit is itself bogus, that it's unconvincing, that it's the wrong way of thinking about economics?
Well, I think it suggests that the obsession we have and the fear that we have about government deficits is very much ill-conceived and misguided in almost all cases. The deficit is just, it's a rotten word. That's the problem. The fact that we use this term to refer to a budget outcome where the government is putting more money into the economy than it is taking out. Okay, if we called it a surplus, it's every bit as much a surplus as it is a deficit. But we only choose to describe it in one way. We refer to it with respect to what's happening on the government's balance sheet, but we completely ignore what their deficit does to other balance sheets. So if the difference between two numbers, right? So if the government is spending $100 into the economy, but it's only taxing $90 back out, we label that a government deficit. What we forget to do is pay attention to the fact that there's now $10 sitting in some part of the economy that is a surplus put there by the government's deficit spending. So, I wish we didn't call it a deficit. I wish we would look at it from our own perspective, right? From the perspective of the economy as a whole, it's a financial surplus. So that's one of the points that MMT tries to remind us of, so that we can have maybe a different relationship in terms of our thinking with this idea of fiscal responsibility and where we want the government's budget to land, and how excited we get when we see headlines that scream, $1 trillion deficits or something like that. We could have a very different political discourse and a very different policy debate if we could get over this kind of mental hurdle and visceral reaction that we have to just the very notion or the word deficit.
Stephanie, throughout our series, we've talked about the relationship between growing inequality, particularly in the US economy, and the rise of authoritarian populism. How does MMT play into that? My understanding would be that if the government adopted MMT, there would be much more significant investment in the economy, which in turn would reduce inequality. Is that a fair way of thinking about it?
I think I might say it a little differently. I might say if a Congress or a parliament approached the federal budgeting process through an MMT lens or an MMT understanding, then we could attenuate many of the inequities that I think you rightly note are drivers of angst that authoritarians can take advantage of. So, MMT is meant to be a lens. It's a description. It's a macroeconomic framework, right? So you can open up a book and you can study and learn how the economy works, how the monetary system works. You can get an MMT understanding, and that's your lens. It fixes your vision so that you aren't seeing things that aren't there, like barriers and obstacles surrounding the debt or the deficit or borrowing from China or burdening the next generation. We can clear all of that away, give you better vision. But the reality is that with that set of new lenses, with that better picture, an authoritarian could take that framework and use it to build walls, border walls, and do, all sorts of things. A progressive would take that lens and use it to build hospitals and schools and care for communities and the planet. And so MMT isn't a set of policies that come prepackaged that you implement. It's just mostly a description of the monetary system and the fiscal space, if you like, the capacities of the federal government to take advantage of the monetary system we have more fully to carry out an agenda. Now, what that agenda looks like, that's politics.
Stephanie, as we speak, the US government has borrowed $2 or $3 trillion to deal with the coronavirus crisis. Does that suggest that the government, the Trump government, and the current Fed are in the MMT camp? They seem to be borrowing indiscriminately.
Well, borrowing indiscriminately isn't MMT. So again, MMT is a descriptive lens. It's us explaining to folks how our monetary system works. And we're not on a gold standard anymore. Okay, so the monetary system underwent a significant change in particular after 1971, when President Nixon took the US off the gold standard, what was effectively a gold standard, where the dollar was convertible into gold internationally on demand at a fixed price. After that, we left that system. The dollar is now a floating currency. We have a floating exchange rate, and the monetary system works differently. The government does not promise to convert dollars into gold for anybody at a fixed price or into anything else. It's a pure fiat currency. And so what Congress has done recently, responding to COVID and the economic fallout, is to start passing a lot of legislation. Okay, we had 4 bills go through the House and Senate and get signed by the president. Trillions of dollars in new spending have been authorized by Congress without tax increases. Okay, so now that means that the deficit is getting bigger. The government is committed to spending more dollars into the economy than it is taxing back out. You're asking about the borrowing piece. And so right now, we could talk about why the government does this at all, but right now, and for a long period of time, the federal government has matched up its deficit spending with bond sales. So if the government runs $1 trillion deficit, it sells $1 trillion worth of new treasuries. Okay, that's the way we do things. So we're not doing anything any differently than we've ever done it. And MMT isn't different today than it would have been 10 years from now. We're just describing how it all works. So the government spends, let's say, $4 trillion into the economy, but only taxes back $1 trillion, then that means the government is running a $3 trillion deficit. So it will sell $3 trillion worth of US treasuries. But remember that if the government spends $4 trillion in and only taxes $1 trillion back out, it's leaving $3 trillion in the economy. The borrowing part is the government taking those $3 trillion back out of the system and replacing them with a different kind of government money, with treasuries that are government bonds that are effectively dollars, right? But they pay interest. So they're replacing them with interest-bearing currency. And that's all that's happening.
The subtitle of your book, Stephanie, is The Birth of the People's Economy. It's not a people's economy. What does this look like, ideally? I know you're an advisor in the Democratic Party. You're clearly a progressive. If Trump is defeated, what kind of people's economy would you like to see emerge in the US post November 2020? And how will this strengthen democracy?
So I know the kind of world that I would like to live in, but in the final chapter of the book, where the title of the chapter is, building an economy for the people, this is up to the people. I mean, that's the beauty of democracy and I feel like that what I hope this book does is help to level the playing field so that we all have access to the right understanding of how the monetary system works and what we can actually ask and expect of our government. Because right now, a member of Congress comes back to his or her district and goes in a town hall and stands before their constituents, and voters say, why aren't you doing more to get money for education or for healthcare or for infrastructure? They harangue them and they say, why aren't you doing more? And their politician could say, oh, I agree with you. I have so much empathy for what you're asking for. And believe me, I would love to be able to deliver. But we got this deficit. We got a $23 trillion debt. We just can't have these things. So I'm trying in this book, when I say level the playing field, I want everyone to have a clear understanding of what the government's fiscal capacities are. Okay, money is no object, literally or figuratively. If Congress deems something a priority, it can write a bill. If you find the votes, the money will be there and the spending will happen. The risk can never be that we don't have the money for something, that we'll run out of money, that we'll go broke as a nation. The relevant constraint on the government's budget is inflation. So if everyone understood that, then we could have a better debate about how we want to use our nation's resources. How many workers do we think it's appropriate for the federal government to employ provisioning public services, healthcare or education, doing roads and bridges and building climate-resistant infrastructure and so forth? How much? Let's have that debate. And that's the people's economy. That's where the people get to weigh in, participate in the democratic process. Congress is supposed to be there to vote for legislation that carries out the will of the people, that supports a people's agenda within the constraints that we face, right? Recognizing that there are limits. We can't have it all. We have to prioritize, but let the public's desires be reflected in the budget itself, so that the government is dedicating resources as available to carrying out, what the people in this country want to have. And, we know that they want healthcare. We know that you can look at the polls. We sort of have a sense of what the population would like to have. It's just that we're told that we can't afford these things. And so that's the difference.
Wearing your people's hat as Stephanie Kelton, a US citizen, is that what you want? More investment in the people itself rather than just a narrow slither of wealthy people in the United States? Because it seems at the moment, one of the consequences of the coronavirus crisis is that the chasm between rich and poor in America is actually deepening, that the wealthy are staying at home and making money through the stock market. The poor are having to go out to work, they're catching the disease, and they're being made unemployed. Would the people's economy change all that?
I mean, it would if I didn't have to ask anybody else for permission and I could just pull all the levers.
Well, I'm giving you, Stephanie, I'm giving you that permission now in the abstract.
And then, for me, the worst kind of suffering is gratuitous suffering. Okay, so that's how I feel. If you can make some people better off without, compromising, sacrificing, not going to risk to national security or the next generation, all these things that we're told, we can't act, we can't fix problems because of the deficit, because of the debt, and all the myths that are bound up in that. Once we ignore all that, we realize we can solve real problems. And I think you're absolutely right. The degree of income and wealth inequality that exists in this country today is so extreme that it rivals the levels last seen right before the Great Depression. I mean, we know that. And economists know that this isn't just a problem in terms of the way our economy functions. It's also a problem for the way our democracy works or doesn't, right? Those extreme concentrations, and especially of wealth, give rise to such power over the political process that it becomes corrosive to our democracy. So yes, we have to address that. And along the way, we can address a lot of problems. Chapter 7 of the book is called The Deficits That Matter. And, I talk about the retirement crisis, student debt crisis, healthcare in America, education, infrastructure, climate, all of these, problems that we face as society and in our community. So what would I want to do? I would love to build a care economy. I would love to make the kinds of investments in people and in our communities that allow us to start caring for one another, to care for our communities, our people, and our planet. And I think, one of the ways that I suggest that we do that is through a public service employment program or a federal job guarantee, something modeled on like what FDR did in the New Deal era. There was an alphabet soup of jobs programs, the Work Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the National Youth Administration. You look at what's happening around the country today. You look at the unemployment numbers, tens of millions of people. We are in for real trouble in terms not just of our economy, but for society. If we leave tens of millions of people languishing in unemployment, social unrest, youth without jobs, we have got to do something to address that. So I would do a lot of bold things.
This is great stuff, Stephanie. Finally, I love what you're saying, and you're not just another citizen. You're a very influential economist. Your book is a New York Times bestseller. You have the ear of notable Democratic policymakers and power brokers. How receptive do you think the Democratic Party is now to MMT theory and your arguments about the need for fundamental reform and a fundamental rethink of what economics actually is and the role of government?
Well, I am fortunate in that I do get to have conversations with House members, with members of the Senate, sometimes on both sides of the aisle, but more often than not with members of the Democratic Party. And, I think that I'm optimistic because, Democrats, I think, have reached the conclusion that they have been duped. and that they've sort of been like Charlie Brown to Lucy in the football for a long time when it comes to the deficit and the debt, right? That every single time the Republicans are in power, they run the same playbook. You know exactly what they're going to do. They're going to cut taxes, they're going to build up defense, and then the deficit's going to get big. And only when a Democrat is in office do they start to find religion on deficits again. Meanwhile, the Democrats keep their religion throughout the whole process. Then whether they have, you know, the political power or whether they're in the minority, they still continue to try to hold themselves to a different and they think higher standard. But I do think that that's changing, and I'm getting that in conversations that they feel like, listen, if they're lucky and they win the White House come November and they pick up seats in the Senate, they don't want to be in a situation where they have to obsess about the deficit and not try to carry out some kind of an agenda that, you know, leads to job creation, investments in infrastructure and education and so forth. So I think there's progress for sure.
And this is only going to strengthen democracy, isn't it? Finally, Stephanie. I assume that if this is actually instituted, and we at least attack some of the graver inequities in society, that our democracy will be stronger too.
I absolutely think that. And, you know, I think that there are places around the world where I think there are some good examples being set. And I think New Zealand is a good example of this, where the government is approaching the federal budget in a really different way, right? They're actually doing something that looks to me like mission-oriented budgeting, where you justify to the population in a very transparent way. You say, look, the government is going to be making investments in these 5 broad categories, and the goals are to bring about real change, right? To improve people's lives, to improve health, to improve the educational outcomes. So I would love to see Congress start writing budgets where the aim of the budget is not to balance over some arbitrary time frame, to balance the government's books, but instead to balance conditions in our economy, to rebalance the distribution of income and wealth, to attack child poverty and poverty as a whole, to deal with joblessness and infrastructure and all of these things. And I think that, you know, if you just communicate with the public that these are the reasons that we're putting more resources into these places, and we're going to hold ourselves accountable. We want to see that those investments are bringing about, you know, the improvements that we're looking at. We want our infrastructure grade to rise from its current D+ status to a B by the end of 4 years, or whatever the case may be, right? I think people would be extremely receptive to that kind of approach. And yes, it would involve a lot more people in the democratic process and improve lives for a whole swath of this country that's really been hurting, not just, you know, the last decade, but for decades.